All right. Great. So hi, everybody. So for today's lesson, we're going to be jumping into what is data storytelling. So data storytelling at Flow, ultimately at Flow, what we're solving for is pretty basic. So at a very basic level, we're solving for three fundamental things. One is levels of engagement in a meeting. Is your audience actually paying attention? Two, do they actually understand the content? Or are they just nodding along? And then three, levels of interaction. If you can actually have them participate in the meeting, that's how you start to move things forward. And so if you can solve for those three sub problems, that we can drive better data-driven decisions in the workforce, and as well as in the enterprise use case, more sales conversions. And so we do that through data storytelling. And so data storytelling on a very basic level is the story, the empathy you can drive with the story, combined with the logic that you can drive with the data visualization. And so it's that merging of the logic and the emotion together that really drive data stories forward. And so today, we're really going to dive deeper into quite a few flows that we've built, and some of the A/B test cases in some sense I've sort of indirectly have done, telling the same story multiple times, but just slight differences in terms of how we presented it, who presented it, the story, the message, and the difference in reaction, I think, is quite amazing to see. But before I go further, I guess any questions before I jump into some more details here, just, I guess, holistically in what we mean by sort of data storytelling, or this idea that it's sort of this blend of the story and the data visualization side of things.
Greetings, Michael.
Hello. Oh, hey, there's Seth. How's it going?
Good. Sorry, we're back to the office, so it's a little tricky going on my laptop and being on the screen in the office. But I guess I'm just curious in general, like how much of the product or how many of your users build things that are intended for kind of internal meetings, messaging, reporting, versus like anything that's sort of external or public facing?
Yeah, good question. So I would say that the majority of Flow users or Flow enterprise customers that have really seen success and continue to use it really focused on the external use case first. The ones that focused on the internal use case, the more analytics driven use case, where we worked with like a pretty heavy data analytics team, and they were presenting internally to some stakeholders, and it was good, but the ROI was the hard part. It's like, okay, what's the real value here of our internal messaging? It's way harder to codify than it is for any external communications. So I would say that on sort of the overall value side, external communications just has an easier case to prove, at least in the enterprise. But then even for news organizations in terms of marketing and putting new stories out there, I think that external communication has really sort of been more of our sweet spot, because it's, at a core, sort of, we're communicating from experts to non-experts. That's sort of the dividing line of like what we're trying to solve, or our unique value in the world. And I think that lends itself more towards external stakeholders. But we have been used, I'd say more so in the beginning, especially for early on proof of concepts, in sort of more high, meetings with upper stakeholders. So it's a smaller group of individuals, but sort of higher level at an organization. So I think that's also applicable. So I'd say those are sort of the two use cases, but yeah, good question. All right. Any other questions before we start to dive into some more details here? Okay. Cool. So first off, just a little show and tell, because I was working on this until super late last night. But I don't know if you guys have seen, there's a data visualization that is was released by NASA. Let me actually pull it up. Of climate anomaly data. So I don't know if you guys have seen this data visualization, but it's been going around the web for a couple of weeks here. And it was released by NASA, showing temperature anomalies from 1880 until today. And so you can sort of see this animation going around and watching it between this 0 degrees Celsius, -1 degree Celsius, +1 degree Celsius. And basically see the whole thing animate. And the story more or less is that over time, we're seeing temperature anomalies continue to get warmer and warmer over time. And then what's cool is they actually show that this was a 3D visualization. So we're really cool to see that released by NASA. And so we just took this, or I took the same data last night and was experimenting further with that and taking it just a different angle. And this was sort of my attempt late last night, where you're now flying through time as opposed to just seeing the observation sort of in a static portion. And then you're seeing the labels here. So we have 5 numbers for every year. And we're just showing sort of the highlights, I guess, in some sense of the temperature. But yeah, so, you know, a different take on the same story. But oftentimes what I find is that the best data stories, or the ones that perform the best, are oftentimes not the first time we presented it, but it was something we presented like, you know, 5 months ago, and we're revisiting, we're bringing it back up. And I think that idea of iterating through a story does have a lot of legs to it in terms of its ability to really push the boundary in terms of the story, as well as the visualization itself. So I highly encourage sort of remixing. It's sort of like a core element, I think, to what we do. And so that remix capability, because essentially what I did was build off of a coworker of mine. So Jason took the initial stab at working with this data set, and now I've taken another take on that same data set, just a different view. And I think that that's capability of going through multiple iterations, I think, is extremely helpful. So how we typically, you know, go about telling a data story is to think of it as several sort of components, that you have this beginning section, the middle, and the ending. So in the very beginning, you're setting up the situation. Here's the situation. Then you're adding the complication, the rising action, or some sort of, you know, something we're fighting against, and some sort of hero that needs to be recognized. And that at the end, we have some sort of climax where we reach a tipping point. Then there's a resolution, and that story resolves. And so these same story components are still in data stories. And the difference is that data stories just bring the data into it. But I think the thing I often see is that people miss the empathy side. They miss the people side. They just focus on the data, the raw output, but not the story side of like the human elements. And I think that's actually one of the keys to unlocking a lot of this. One sort of very prime example that comes to mind for me is actually the difference between me telling a story about our baby and my wife telling a story about our baby. I think is like night and day difference in terms of ability to build empathy with someone. Wow. That this story, which went very viral, was, sorry, let me mute this site real quick. There we go. You know, it was super impactful because she was mostly the one doing all this, right? She is the main character here, not me reporting on my wife changing diapers. And I think that element actually made a huge impact in terms of the relatability to the person telling the story, but even just hearing about her emotional experience of doing all this, the amount of time and effort that took, that is what people were connecting with. They could see themselves in Kristen when she's presenting it. That was the difference between that and my attempts to sort of do something similar, but, you know, sort of just talking about the data and going through it. So maybe my take or my view of the data was more unique or whatever, but I think it's that empathy layer that actually is the real important thing to connect to. You want your audience to connect with the story, the empathy, the experience, and then see themselves in the data. I think that's sort of the key highlight of sort of what really can work. And so this was the same data that I called the ringer, that it looks more like a washing machine, like tumbler for caring for a newborn. But anyways, so I digress a bit here, but I do think that's, that is an important aspect here. And so one case example is the Texas blackout story. It's a bit of a longer narrative that I'm going to go through, but I'd like to just point out a few sort of highlights of sort of how I structured this presentation after the fact, and I think that will help to understand sort of data storytelling a little bit more holistically. So to start out this story, there's sort of two things you need to know. So the first is the frequency of alternating current going into your house. That's the current going into your house is alternating frequency that's typically around 60 hertz. And if it goes above that by a little or below that, it is actually causing damage to any circuitry or any motors or generators that are on the platform. In addition, you need to know that there's the Western interconnect, the Eastern interconnect, and then there's Texas. So this is sort of the situation. You need to understand that. And so we're looking at Texas back in February of last year when there was the large blackout. And so the things we're going to look at are temperature, the demand in megawatts, the supply in megawatts, and the price in US dollars. And to start out, the very simple level, it got cold, got really cold. It's typically around 50 or it's in the 50s, and we're below freezing as of February 11th. And the demand for electricity during this time only increases. That we start at 40,000 megawatts and we're up to 72 megawatts by the 13th. And mind you that back in 2011, the last outage in Texas, it was at 59 gigawatts, which was the max load back then. So already we're past previous peaks. And on the supply side, we're at 100% capacity, and that capacity is made up of about half natural gas, 30% wind, and then the rest. And as we start to play this forward, you'll see that the very first day on the 10th, we see a pretty large decline in wind power or wind generation capacity, that we're down 61%, down to 61% capacity for wind generation. And that when we start to play this forward even further, no power has been turned off for anyone. But what we can start to see is there's some interesting things going on with the price of electricity. That we go from $30 around the 10th to 10x that, to around $300 at a peak on the 12th. But this is where I think things really start to become apparent that something's going on. Even though no power has been turned off, we're starting to see supply decrease while demand increases, and we see the price really skyrocket. And so we're seeing, we see it go way, way up. And this is one of those things that I think XR is really good at. It's really good at showing scale. This idea of building empathy into a store or into the data, I think is a key element of what we can do inside of Flow. And so we reach a peak now at $7,000 on the 14th. And so it was then this evening that we see a larger decrease in capacity, and that's mostly on the natural gas side that caused that decrease, but it was across the board, a coal plant, a nuclear plant, solar was going offline. And so it's really all of that in total that is the issue. And so if you can put yourself back into the shoes of someone in the operating center of ERCOTs, that they have to choose whether to turn off customers or to, well, yeah, that's basically the only choice they have. Because if they don't, it actually causes damage to equipment. And each of these power facilities actually has a really large circuit breaker that's sort of like what you have at your house. But in their case, if the frequency goes too low or too high, it actually disconnects from the grid itself, so taking the power plant offline. And so if you can imagine what's going on here, this is when they choose to turn their first customers off, and that has the net effect of helping to raise the frequency. And anytime a power plant goes offline, that has the effect of dropping the frequency. And so this little red planes, 59.4 degrees or hertz, is the threshold by which those circuit breakers start to tick. And so you can see we get below the threshold at 1:51 in the morning. And that's when they decided to turn off 3 gigawatts worth of customers. Now, mind you, the last outage in Texas was actually 5 gigawatts total. So this is not like a small number of customers are turning off. It's actually a pretty sizable chunk. And right then there's that timer that starts. They basically have 9 minutes between this start and getting the power above, or the frequency above that line, before it's basically a very large cascade of a rolling blackout that would actually have lasted for almost a month. Because to recover from a complete blackout is actually not a very non-trivial technical task. And so then it was at 1:55, so 4 stressful minutes later, that you're in the control center and they have to turn off 3.5 gigawatts worth of customers. And so the net effect is, yes, they were able to recover, and that this cycle, this pattern of power plants going offline, the frequency dropping, needing to turn off more customers, continues to go on and on. And so it's these 3 days, that in net doesn't look like a lot. It's these little red section, 20 gigawatts total load shed, 4.5 million customers. But the crazy thing is this cost more than Katrina. It was 195 billion worth of damages, 70 people died. And yet I think we as a society really moved on quite quickly from that, because it was sort of easily to understand. But I think seeing this all together, in a very simple story, got cold, and that cold caused issues to supply, and that you can really see those supply demand constraints when you look at the price where it reached its peak. It's actually a max cap of $9,000 in the state of Texas for the wholesale price of electricity, and it reached that cap. And so, all in all, that's sort of the story that I'm telling here for Texas, and sort of getting a better mental image of what's going on here. So first off, I guess any questions on this story in particular, but the additional thing is I will start to break up sort of the different components of this story and highlight just a few things. Okay, so let me just go through a few small items here that I think are sort of unique. So first is the beginning steps, really just setting up the situation to understand that you're sort of leading on that by introducing this frequency graph, that we're going to revisit it at some point. And that understanding that below this threshold, there is a timer that kicks in, sort of sets that the stage of something to come, sort of alluding to that future. And then this is additionally sort of setting up the stage. So these stage categories, or the setting up of the scene, I think is an important beginning step. The rise in conflict is really the increase in demand, the shock impacts to supply, and the price of electricity. So all these sort of complications, I think, all lead up to this sort of climactic point where we see price go super high, and then we see customers get turned off. And so that's sort of the peak of the story where we dive in, and that's when we take a segue and move back into that control center to think about the emotional impact of what it was like to actually be in the control center turning off customers. And so that was really the intent here, is why add this little side element of what's going on inside the power plant for these stressful 4 little minutes. It's really just the emotional characteristics of what is it like to do these things. And so the last step here, really closing it off, is the resolution of how much it costs, and the conclusion. So that's sort of my breakout of sort of the story in general, but maybe some of the components that I think start to weave this story together. This is definitely a longer story, which is somewhat atypical of more of the flows that we've been seeing people create lately. But that said, I think that's it hits on a lot of the story components that are pretty important to cover. So let me pause there and see what questions you guys have.
Yeah, I don't think I have a question, Michael. I just want to make an observation, though, that the world is awash in data, and stories are lurking inside all that data. And what we found is that the best flows out there are the ones that do tap into that emotional connection with the data story. So, all our visualizations and the whole way the system is set up is structured so that you can evoke responses from your audience based on the visualizations that you weave into your narrative. And all this has to do with the data stories. So on that flow that you just showed, Michael, I think the chart I always come back to is that chart where you look up into the sky and see how that price has literally gone sky high. I mean, that's a memorable, very memorable visual from that presentation. And it alone tells how serious that situation was, because those things generally don't happen like that.
Yeah.
So anyway, it's just an observation that the data storytelling is a really important part of what we do.
Yeah. And one other observation I've made, and this has been maybe more of an exploration area in the last 2 months, is survey data. That's for the longest time, I have been really struggling taking survey data into Flow, where just looking at percentages looked really boring. I don't know how else to phrase it. It was just like, okay, I can show a percentage as dots or knots. And the thing I realized was that there's an inherent difference between when you show the aggregated percentages compared to the data when every dot is literally a person. And so in this case, each dot literally is a survey response. You can see the response. You can actually click in at any time to any of those responses and see the respondent details. And there's something sort of, I haven't quite figured out what it is, but I feel like it's sort of encoded to our core human like physiology to want to see these dots animate and get to a good position, like resolve. But that this idea that you can click in and see anyone, it starts to feel way more tangible. And there's something about the sheer quantity and recognizing that each dot is a person. So here, this is a sales associate making $65K in Cincinnati, Ohio for Frito-Lay. And that you can basically spend all this time and go through everyone. You can also go through some of the big outliers. Like here's someone at the LA Lakers making $45 million a year. This was sort of just a random data set that was put out by someone on TikTok, actually, that had 47,000 people respond to it. And there was something, yeah. So anyways, this view of the data where we're basically just stacking things on top of each other, looking at basically a histogram, I think is drawn out to way more power when we start to play with the data in this way, or start to look at the data this way. So, you don't often hear empathy and data together, but I think when you can do it successfully, it's extremely impactful. And that's I think part of the idea. It's really helping people see themselves in the data, so that it doesn't feel disconnected, but you can see yourself in it, and you can understand sort of the world around you at a more granular level. So that's sort of one thing I've been more into lately that I think has a lot of validity. And I'm actually working on a story right now, probably more today's one on the Oscar, the Chris Rock versus Will Smith story. And that there was all these surveys that came out afterwards that pointed in very different directions. One of which said that one pointed towards people blaming Chris Rock, and the other saying people pointed to Will Smith and some of the intricacies there. So I'll be looking more at that, so more to come there. Now, this has mostly been me sort of talking aloud to you guys, and I would like to make this a little bit more participatory for those that do have editor accounts. And I know we have some prospects as well, so we can sort of follow along. But one thing that we've done is that in the editor, we just have 2 very basic data sets you can start out with. But I'll tell you, these data sets you can spend years on. And I kid you not, you really can. And this life expectancy data is year-date combinations for a selection of countries, looking at the population, income, as well as a few other attributes, including life expectancy. But the other thing is that Sierra actually went through, and on this event column, we actually labeled out quite a few key events. So the Vietnam War, Civil War, lots of different items that we sort of labeled to help tell a story. And so in this data set, just to quickly put it together, I'm just going to put on the width axis the year. On the height axis, I will put life expectancy. And so we can start to see this very basic structure come to life, where we are looking at 1850 till today, and the life expectancy of that country that year. And I'm going to update that. And so let me add some depth here. We can look at the difference.
Hey, Mike, I'm not sure you're sharing your screen. I'm not.
Oh, I'm sorry. Geez, I'm going through all of this without anyone seeing anything. That's not good. Okay, let me start that, or one step back. Thank you, Bill. So the within our flow, the two data sets I'm describing, let me delete this swarm. So if I add a swarm, there's this from library, and there's two data sets. One is global life expectancy, and the other is 10,000 cities. And that within global life expectancy, you have a lot of attributes here. The one I was describing earlier was this event column, where Sierra's gone through and labeled quite a lot of events. And so the thing to highlight here in terms of how you can sort of practice telling these stories or practice going through this is to pick out some of those events and highlights. And so to quickly go through that, what I'm going to do here is first add in some colors. So I'll add a color scheme based on the continents. And let me add some connections, which is a way to connect the dots together. And I'm going to connect them based on the country, and then set up some interactions so that when you click on a dot, we pull up some additional information, including the year, country, life expectancy, which we will round, and population in millions, and income, add a $, and there we go. So when we click on a dot now, we see that additional information come in, and that I can also add one last thing, just that's, there we go. And so this is, so we used to ask about this big decline in 1918, and we sort of stopped after the pandemic and seeing the Spanish flu. But essentially within this data set, since we're looking at life expectancy over the last 200 years, there's a lot of micro stories to drill into. So one of which is, looking at the 1918 Spanish flu. You could do that multitude of ways. But one we could do is this interaction called a drag axis select. And what that means is that on this x-axis here, which I said axis to isolate is width, if I hit my control key and then drag, I can actually zoom in dynamically into the graph. And so here I'm zooming further and further into 1918, and you can see this big V, basically where life expectancy around the globe decreased in 1918. And so that is very much an artifact of the Spanish flu. But I would very much encourage you to, both explore this data set, but then also this idea of setting up steps where you zoom in and isolate. So here we're looking at Rwanda and the Rwandan genocide of 1994. And so one thing we might do is just to isolate the country itself. And so I'll select country here as the thing to highlight. And actually, the thing I like to do is to turn everything else dark and keep it light. And so that way you can see it more clearly. So now we're highlighting just Rwanda. We could also add some more functionality in here so that you can actually explore a little further. So anyways, a little side note, but I do think that getting your hands dirty and just diving in with this data set, there really is a lot you can start to build with it. Hi, Zenton. Did you have a question?
Sorry, I had the microphone on.
Oh, no worries. All good. All good. So the last things to sort of quickly highlight here, the idea of data that flows between steps. One thing you'll notice through most of our visualizations, or most visualizations, is that we don't, the dots don't disappear. they're always transitioning between steps. And that's actually sort of a core fundamental thing of how we design and build these flows. That's you don't want things to disappear and then new things to appear. Instead, you always want to see that dot transition. It's moving between things. It's not just disappearing. And to just finish this off here, the thing we've been playing around with quite a bit more is this idea that you can start to add micro scatter plots into a flow. And let me change this to a flat map instead of being a sphere. And on this, additional dimensions. So basically the thing I'm going to do is life expectancy. So this idea that you can basically have a map and the same data. And let me rotate this. Not that one. There we go. I'll make it a little bigger. Okay, so here we have that same life expectancy data sets, but now each line is actually over its representative country. And so you should be able to see this go from this graph into this graph where nothing actually disappears. You're just seeing that transition. And so I don't have to explain to you what happens. You can sort of understand that, oh, I'm going from these lines are here, and now they're on the map. Therefore, each of these countries is represented here. And that transition is actually sort of, it's helpful in building these mental models that you're constantly incrementally adding to a story, as opposed to just throwing everything at someone at once and expecting them to sort of absorb it all. I think that incremental build is actually one of the most empathetic ways to tell a story, is really, through those means. So let me pause here. I feel like I'm sort of going around down a lot of these different data story areas, and can dive into some other areas more deeply if you wish. But let me sort of open it up to hear what questions you guys have.
Yeah, I'd be really interested in hearing what people are, when they struck out using flow, what did they have in mind in that, and what types of data stories are you thinking of exploring using flow?
Hi, I'm Zenton. I work in diversity, equity, inclusion in public mental health. And some of the work we do is about, diversity, of course. And we use a lot of videos and images in our presentations. Is there a way that we can use videos or other formats on the flows?
Yeah, great question. So you can use images. We don't have support for embedded videos yet. That is something we can do occasionally, just for more custom projects. So it's feasible, but it's not in the base editor today. But over here, you'll see a section for image. So you can add images, and you can add texts, maps. And then if I expand this advanced UI, there's also buttons. You can actually load a 360 image as well. And just to point this out for everybody, there's a, sorry, I'm not sure which screen guess it. So we have a demo media folder that we sent to everyone, or it's in our community section. We'll have a link to it, and we'll send an email out this week about it. But within this, there's a lot of additional data, sort of sample data sets, sample point clouds, other things you can sort of pull from. And we'll keep adding more and more to this. I was hoping that we'd have some 360 images in this. I don't see any, so I'll pause from that. And we used to have some, but we'll add some more back in. But we used to do a lot more 360 images back in more the VR focused days. But but yeah, the main elements here for adding an image and all of those things are there. Just the videos are not. The sort of workaround in some sense for video is that for any of these objects, or sorry, let me add a button as an example. Or the better example is really a swarm. Let me try to find one real quick. So you can add hyperlinks into the data file so that when someone clicks on a dot, it opens up, or you can see the links, and then you could actually open those links to explore further. And so one example of that is the Voices of VR podcast, where this was Kent Bai, who had over 1,000. He has over 1,000 podcasts out there, and these are the different topics that he covers. And so he categorized all of his episodes, and essentially the thing we did was each of these nodes acts as basically a center of gravity to pull it towards it if that's included. So it becomes sort of like a organizational flow. And the thing is that you can click onto it. You then will see an image of dynamically pulled from the website, as well as you can click on the dot, and that will actually pull up the article and you can listen to it. And so, you know, it's basically a more dynamic way to explore the content, but that's sort of how you can get it a little bit around the video aspects. You just have them click into a YouTube link directly, and then it will direct them there. But that is something we'll definitely consider more and more moving forward, is to include more things besides just images. But yep, that's sort of where we're at.
Perfect.
Yeah, good question. Yeah, what other questions?
It just not really a question, but potentially a suggestion. Some of these flows on the gallery are really good, and I know that you can actually copy them, you know, and put them in your own. But one of the, so it'd be cool to see how they did that, right? How they structure the data. And, you know, you can kind of dissect that as you work through every single step, but it's still, it's just trial now at this particular point to figure out what that looks like. So it'd be great if there was a way to, you know, I particularly like the Trump tweets one, and then what you just showed from the VR podcast. I've actually tried to recreate that using my own data, struggling a little bit through it, but it'd be good to see kind of how we built this.
Yeah, no, that's a great idea, and we'll take that note. I think we can definitely put some videos out on how we built these, and try to record more of the build sessions live. So I'll definitely take that to heart, and try to make it so you don't have to feel like you're a CSI investigator trying to decipher how we built these, and instead sort of can see more step by step the process that we went through. I will say that you know, a lot of these flows that I worked on that are public, the intent is sort of twofold. One, to show the capabilities of the tool set, but then also to push our tech. And so in some instances, I was building something manually before we could do it more automated in our platform. And so that's why some of the flows actually, the data files look a little strange, where I'm like hard coding in positions. But let's, yeah, I'll definitely take that to heart, and help to rebuild some of these, because, you know, in many regards, this kind of structure, like Trump tweets, where you can basically see all of his tweets, and this is the hour of the day, and the time is along this axis as well, can be applied for basically most time series data, where you have lots of data points, and it's at a frequency intervals. So yeah, we'll take that to heart and try to reveal more of the how it's built. But yeah, I think you're definitely picking up on the right idea, which is remixing is definitely the superpower in Flow. And as more and more people start to share more flows with one another, we're going to start to see more and more unique aspects come out here. So highly encourage everyone to click on the 3 dots and click save a copy and edit on any of the featured flows, or any flow that people want to iterate off of, because I do think it's that power of iteration and building off one another's work that really great things can happen. Cool. So I think we're about at the 45-minute timer here, and I've gone through a variety of different areas here and shown quite a few different flows. If you have any specific questions, do not hesitate to reach out to Bill, Sierra, myself. We also have within the site, just to point out, that there is the documentation section, which is our help center. In addition, at any points, you can click Get Support, and that submits a ticket. And we highly encourage you to submit a ticket that way for any questions or requests or bugs you think you encountered, etc. And we'll fix it from there. But anyways, it's been really awesome to connect with you guys this morning and talk through a little bit of data storytelling and sort of recollect myself as I look back through a lot of these stories. But really excited to see what you guys start to do. In many regards, I think the tool itself is not really the hard part of learning here. It's how do I tell a story in this three-dimensional way or in an incremental way that can really be impactful. And so happy to unpack that and explore further with you guys. Bill, Sierra, anything you'd like to add?
Not for me right now, but thanks a lot, Michael, for taking us through the theory of storytelling.
Yeah.
Yeah, just wanted to thank everyone for coming.
All right. Well, thanks everybody, and don't be a stranger, and talk to you guys soon.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.